Bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos desde la Escuela de Cábala y Psicología. La verdad que tenemos el placer muy grande, una gran sorpresa que veníamos trabajando aquí con nuestro amigo Alejandro Dron de la presentación de Rab Hai Michelson. Así que le damos la bienvenida a Jai a esta entrevista que la va a dirigir Alejandro. Quiero, si puedes, Alejandro, darle mis felicitaciones a Rab Michelson por el trabajo que ha realizado con Todo es Dios.
Yeah, he wants to.
I got that part.
Wait.
También informarle, no sé si él está informado, que nosotros hemos creado una yeshiva virtual en castellano para el público hispanoamericano, donde el primer libro que hemos elegido es su libro, Todo es Dios.
Yes, as I was telling you, they started the yeshiva, and it's going to start with your book.
¿No?
This study. ¿Cuántos alumnos ya tiene, empiezan la yeshiva?
La yeshiva más o menos tiene unos 140 alumnos aproximadamente.
Yes, so it's 140 students.
Wow.
They already
Este-
started.
que están estudiando su libro y están realizando preguntas sobre su libro y va a ser un libro de debate en los próximos 6 meses.
So for the next 6 months, they're going to be studying the book. They already have tons of questions, and so they're very excited.
That's an honor. It's wonderful.
Así que le agradecemos mucho a Jai su presencia, le agradecemos también su buena predisposición para el diálogo. Le mandamos un shalom muy grande aquí desde Barcelona, y esperemos que nos venga a visitar a Barcelona.
And he's inviting you to Barcelona one day. I mean,
That's an easy invitation. I love Barcelona.
dice que está muy fácil de aceptar.
Ok, así que le invitamos cuando él quiera venir, y también invitamos a su traductor oficial.
Sí, no, yo este año voy para allá.
Perfecto, excelente. Excelente.
Sí.
Bueno, gracias, un abrazo muy fuerte y ustedes comienzan entonces la grabación de la entrevista.
Sí, muchas gracias, Mario.
Un abrazo grande y shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom.
So thankful that you accepted this interview, and I like to start with what I feel. I feel I'm in front of someone very contemporary, but at the same time, like I have the feeling I'm in 19th century, you know, in Europe, in front of what Jean-Claude Milner called a shoe of knowledge, a shoe, a wise shoe of knowledge, not kind of extinguished a little bit nowadays. And so it's this combination of feelings, no, of being grounded completely in the here and now, but at the same time being in like 1 or 2 centuries ago in Europe.
Oh, thank you. I can assure you, I lead a very normal life.
I know.
We have children. You know, my daughter's doesn't see me that way. So, yeah. But
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. So just to start, I like if you can comment about what are the consequences of living in a dualistic environment, because I always felt myself that this is not an easy experience, and I never read or encountered with someone that could talk a little bit about the diagnosis of the situation, of what it means, because in many circumstances, it seems that we are going against the grain. I mean, if you have a more open point of view.
Well, sure. I think almost every organism that we know of that has a mind or even a nervous system sees itself as separate from the rest of the world. If we didn't, probably evolution would have weeded that out for a long time ago. we have these minds and brains really that are designed to help us survive and make children, and if you think of yourself as separate, you want to make more of you want to do things, the Talmudic rabbi said, without the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination or the inclination towards separateness, no one would build a house, no one would live, certainly no one would have children. And so this is part of how it is, right? This is how how all organisms see themselves. The challenge, I think, obviously, is that's not the only way to see. There's different ways to see. So there's that ordinary mind that gets us through our lives. But then there also seems to be this other capacity to see connection and to see that we know this on a certain level. We stop eating food, we disappear. It's obvious that we're in constant, the body-mind system is in constant relationship with the world. But generally we don't see from that point of view. We don't see from the perspective of connection, or the flip side of connection is the emptiness of the separate self, that all of the ideas in my head come from somewhere else. They may be combined in some way in this body-mind system, but there's nothing that doesn't depend on conditions, right? When the conditions are present, something happens, and when those aren't present, the thing doesn't happen. It's just not, we don't spend a lot of time in that point of view. So from the world's mystical traditions and also contemplative traditions, the idea would be maybe not to stay in that point of view all the time and be kind of permanently an expanded mind, but have some way of seeing the relative and the absolute, either together or shuttling back and forth, or in some way spend some percentage of our time in what the Hasidim call the Mochin de Gadlut, the expanded mind. And that's a mind that isn't oriented toward this self as separate, but is oriented toward the whole.
What about the definition of non-dualism, which is you have A or B, A and B, and it's the combination of the two.
Right.
No? It's not only A and B, no?
Right. So it gets complicated very quickly, considering how simple it is.
Sí.
So most of our lives are spent in dualistic consciousness, as you just mentioned. There are times where we can experience what feels like, or what we think is, unitive consciousness, where the default network of the brain shuts down for a little bit, and we see from a different point of view. So sometimes there's a mistake that immediately happens that says that this, in our separate lives, our separateness is wrong, and that in the unitive mind is right. And that's not quite it, right? So also in separate mind, we're still one, right? So in a way, there's helpful if there could be three terms. So dualistic, unitive, and then non-dualistic. And by non-dualistic, we don't just mean the union part. We mean the union of the union part with the dual part. And that's the tricky bit. I like, in my book, I just mentioned the simple metaphor of like the six-pointed star, the Star of David. So the downward pointing star is toward ordinary consciousness, life, meals, mortgages, cars. Okay. There are then those times where we transcend that. It can be very simple. It doesn't have to be the great mystical experience of all time. It could be as simple as just lighting Shabbat candles, and there's a sense of the sacred. And so that's this part of ourselves represented by the upward pointing triangle, the part that points upward toward the transcendent. But again, the goal, to the extent there's a goal, the idea is not just to have those, to be high all the time, right? If I could just be in that spiritual state all the time, that's not actually how it works. That's not how to live. That may be a monastic ideal in some traditions, but in the ones that I practice in, the idea is to have both of those triangles, right? It's two sides of the same triangle. And there are a lot of images in Christian mysticism. There's the idea of the horizontal bar of the cross is this world of relation, and then there's the upward pointing cross pointing to part of the cross pointing to heaven. But you have both, right? It's not that you leave one behind and have the other. And again, many different traditions have symbols like this.
the integration of no, we have these peak experiences, and then we need to integrate them. Mario is always emphasizing that aspect of all this study, how to integrate. How do you see the place of the personal project in that integration? The you know, your finding your personal project, the meaning of your life within this integration.
Yeah, I think that's a really central question, because there's clearly different lines of personal development, right? So one of them might be this mystical line, but there are also lots of other lines. So you can have wonderful unitive states, but be a bad person, right? You could be a jerk. You could be bad in relationship, or you could be bad politically. You could be bad in all kinds of ways. It's definitely not the case, and I'm not saying this because I came up with it, but just if you look around the world, there are clearly people who have powerful spiritual states, but are ethical infants, right, or children, and they're just not ethical. We see this with abusive teachers. We see it with people in religious communities who clearly are having, powerful religious states, but then won't do any work on themselves to kind of where they might have blind spots or prejudices, for example. So people can have powerful mind states and come out and be very violent toward people they see as other, right? So it's not just that you're mean to people, but you can really be ethically evil. That coexists with having some sort of sublime state. So to me, the relative is where all of this happens, right? None of this, maybe from the sense of the absolute, doesn't matter if you're evil. I mean, who cares, right? It's all the absolute. But from that perspective, it doesn't matter if we destroy our planet, right, and climate change or in some other way. From the perspective of the absolute, a dead Earth it's just more of the absolute, right? So clearly that's not the end. That's not where we want to end up, right? The absolute is part of it, but the relative is the other part. And so for me, at least, all of everything else comes right back into being. So maybe I'll have some powerful experience, but then as soon as I come back down to this world, okay, how am I in relationship to my partner? How am I in relationship to livelihood? How am I in relationship to people who are vulnerable and who are marginalized? And that comes back immediately. And all of the tools that are familiar from the toolkit, whether it's therapy or political waking up or whatever, anything that's ordinary in there, I'm going to say ordinary, anything that's in our personal growth toolkit becomes just as valid as it was before, because I come back and I'm in relationship. And again, if we're looking for kind of myths or symbols that convey this, Moshe, if he was just Moses, if he was just a mystic, he could go up the mountain, have his mystical experience, done, right? That's the end. Save us a lot of reading. We'd have the 2 books of Moses instead of the 5 books. He goes up on Mount Sinai, has a mystical experience, and it's finished, right? But that's not the myth, right? The myth is it goes up, has the mystical experience, comes down with a bunch of guidelines or rules or laws about how to behave ethically. And I always felt, it's funny, as someone, I think only some people really are inclined to this mystical consciousness, and I happen to be one of them. And I wanted more of those. I want Moshe to come down and give me instructions. How do I get up the mountain? I want that, why are you telling me about don't steal and, don't lie? Tell me about how to do what you just did, but that's not the myth.
Well, in Everything is God, I have the feeling that I could say that it finishes like with a stuttering, like with a lot of doubts. So, which is I found it very very interesting that if you wanted a system or a big answer. Moshe's stuttering, no?
No, that's good. Yeah. That's lovely. Yeah.
At the end of the book. I find it very, very interesting.
Right. I mean, that's also a lovely point, right? So he goes and has his peak experience, but when he comes back down, he's got the same shadow as before, right? It's not like it magically cured his ability, to speak, or it's not that, and he makes mistakes after those experiences, right? He hits the rock, he makes big mistakes, and that seems very human to me, that even this figure of perfection is definitely not perfect. And, there is no, even in the Zohar where it makes Shimon Bar Yochai into this kind of mystical hero, even he's not perfect. There's none of these myths have some idea that by doing all of this thing and having these experiences that your very human difference gets erased. It just doesn't. And that's, I've only had a few decades of experience in these worlds, but everyone who I've met who says that they're perfect is the most flawed of all. Because they haven't seen, they haven't integrated their own shadow or their own stuff, and it's the perfection of imperfection that I'm attracted to.
I've been watching some videos, and I have this feeling of that I share with you, that I feel I'm still a kid, but with all the scholarship and all the perils and journeys and incredible experiences and tremendous I don't know how to say it, tremendous amount of expansion and restriction and the combination of the building of oneself. There's a part that it's kind of it was protected. It wasn't damaged over all these journeys. And I wonder if that's not I don't know. It occurred to me right now in the conversation. If it's part of what we're talking about, if the Torah, I don't know, it comes to my mind like the Torah as a fence, or this idea of protecting ourselves. But operating with a very strong dynamic of going and returning, but at the same time trying to protect that purity, or I don't know how to call it.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe there's a tension there, or even a paradox, because when we're trying too much to protect, right, we're closing up. So we want to open. But that to me is where there's value. In contemporary language, people use the word safe space. So there's safe spaces for different groups of people. There's also safe spaces for a contemplative, and to open up in a way that exposes that core is scary, right? And it has to be for me at least, in a context where I feel it's okay for that childlike part to emerge. Because for me, that childlike part is also connected to wonder and to mysticism and to creativity and all of these poetic, you're an artist. I mean, to connect with that part of oneself, I think that's maybe one of the most vital parts. But that part, is tender, and I wouldn't want that part always out at stake in every conversation, especially when I've been doing political work. I don't share that part in that kind of work. Yeah.
Because now it's like more the poetic. There's this Chilean writer, Vicente Huidobro, who once wrote that poetry is in the dawn, in that space in between the day and night, and then everything else, it's kind of production and embellishment, or so we need to be very careful not to damage that poetry that it's born in 1 nanosecond. And then,
he sounds like a morning person. I drink a lot of coffee.
No.
I understand.
I'm a night too, but this idea of always being aware of that of the down. I don't know if it's well pronounced. Because there is where everything important happens, and then we need to be very careful how to handle that. I mean, from an artistic point of view, but maybe it has to do with what we're talking about.
No, that feels right to me. I think, well, you could talk more about the relationship of the artistic and the spiritual, but sure, there are these tiny moments, that might occur, and it is like a dawn. There's this little bit of light And already when it's light, now it's developed, right? But there's that little, that slight movement of the heart. Yeah, sounds right to me.
Mhm. What I mean, jumping a little bit to politics.
Mm.
I don't know because you just mentioned how you can relate this connection with the Dawn with politics.
Yeah, I don't have a close relationship. And I think the reason for me is that, for me, politics in particular is connected to the ethical and how we are to act toward one another and toward the planet. And that for me, it seems much a different arena in a certain way. I think where there's a connection, so Richard Rorty, the pragmatist philosopher, 20th century, said that you have to start from someplace. Your politics has to start from someplace. And he says, let's start from the position that cruelty is the worst thing that we do, whether it's to other people, to animals, to the planet. And he doesn't really have an explanation for why that's where we start. Maybe you could start somewhere else. Maybe you could say that strength is the best thing we do, and you could become a fascist or something like that. But he says that there's just this birth of, for him, it's grounded in kind of a birth of morality or ethics. This kind of, but he admits there's no real way to. There's no foundation. He's just going to say he's an anti-foundationalist. In fact, he says we're going to start here. That cruelty is bad, and that resonates for me when we see the effects of cruelty, whether it's extreme cruelty or even just little, a small act of cruelty. There's something in the heart that feels like this is wrong, that we want less of this. We'll never eradicate suffering completely, maybe in the Buddhist Messianic age, but we're never going to do it. But that we want less of this. Children suffering, or we can think of any example where there's cruelty, and that for me is the connection point where Rorty just says we're just going to start here because we have to start somewhere, and there's no foundation. There's no ultimate way to say, there's no lawgiver for Rorty. There's no Torah. There's no Zarathustra. It's just, here's this moral intuition. That's the extent for me of the connection that you asked about. It's about getting in touch with that primal moral intuition that cruelty is bad. We should do less of it. And from that, the rest is details, right? That's all of the work of politics, of waking up, whether it's racism or whether it's violence or whatever it is. It's awakening to that, how we want to lessen cruelty, how that plays out in every aspect of our lives. But it's just that one little connection point. Maybe like you said, it's the dawn, And the dawn for me is that awakening of compassion. We'll shift from Rorty to Buddhist language, right? So
and then all the fractal of identity.
And then everything
battles.
unfolds, right? But it unfolds in a way that doesn't depend for me on that spiritual root. It doesn't depend on the dawn. There's just, again, so in the Buddhist tradition, when there's wisdom, there comes compassion, right? That's just another way of saying what Rorty said. So when there's real understanding of some kind of wisdom, compassion just flows, right? And you wouldn't want a world where there's cruelty. And that doesn't, there's not like a myth about that. There can be a myth if somebody wants to subscribe to the biblical myth, and God creates the world, God sets the morality, and we should do unto others as we want them to do to us. And that's if someone has that belief. For me, it's just that compassion flows from wisdom. And I want my heart to hurt more, not less.
And that nanosecond of compassion, could jump over all the identity battles and be articulated in a like an universal government of wise people that would be above the politicians, governing with universal values the whole planet.
This is not my vision.
But how do you find the idea?
For me, yeah, way too much power, way too few people, and who would ever agree, and who would ever, and I don't, yeah, no, I like the messiness of something that looks like democracy, and maybe we can grope toward it a little bit. And I don't have even a messianic vision where there's a benevolent small group of people. It's just not my vision. For me, it's a lot of people getting in touch with that spark of compassion or of and then working out. It's a lot of details to work out. Economic policy, environmental policy, and that takes a lot of expertise. Those are every problem I can think of in my brain is a very complicated thing to figure out that experts have devoted their lives to, and that I don't think wisdom has the answer. And again, I'll frame it in a myth, right? So, in the Kabbalah, the consciousness kind of has these three parts: Keter, which is this ineffable, connection to the divine; Chokhmah, wisdom, is wisdom, right? But that doesn't give birth to anything. What gives birth to everything is Binah, the cosmic mother. And Binah is sometimes understanding, translated as understanding, but it's also Havana. It's also it's distinguishing, and it's understanding difference, and it's the left brain. And so for me, yes, Chokhmah is that animating spark, but all of the problems that we face as a species have to be solved with Binah, with as much reason as we can possibly find from lots of people thinking really well about it. And I don't think the people who have Chokhmah are necessarily the ones who have Binah.
No, sure.
Myself included, obviously.
Obviously. So how was Shei's Binah Chokhmah configuration when he was a teen, and how is the configuration nowadays?
That's a lot harder. It's easy to talk about the world. I don't want to talk about myself. That's much harder.
But isn't it the same?
Well, no, it's not. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I've noticed. So now in our decade, there's a lot of good podcasts, and you can really listen in like a little eavesdropper on people's spiritual conversations. And some of the ones that I've enjoyed, a lot of times the host will say, what were you like as a child, and almost invariably the people who are attracted to mystical whatever spiritual stuff were a little bit weird, right, as a kid. And there's one podcast, I forget the name of it, that's about magic, and he always says, were you a weird kid? And every single guest who hears that on says yes, and then they explain how they were weird. And that just seems true to me. There's something, probably every poet is that way also. Maybe every talented artist was that way. Like a little bit of, maybe a little bit of an outsider, but definitely like a little bit different in one way or another. And for me, that was certainly true. So that Chokhmah piece for me when I was a child, again, was very private, wasn't something, and I learned pretty quickly that doesn't get shared. And there wasn't really a space for that. It's interesting, you said as a teenager, I got very interested in Jewish practice more as a teenager. So I was raised an American Jew. I grew up Jewish, and I got a Jewish education, but the idea that I would voluntarily choose to do it, that actually came when I was a teenager. And I'd had these kind of, what's funny looking back on it, is I had a lot of not very Jewish experiences, but Judaism was the language that I'd grown up with to translate that. It's what do I do? So Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel, wonderful theologian of the last century, said that religion starts with wonder, right? But it's a response to that wonder. So part of it is okay, how can I have more wonder? But part of it, a bigger part for Heschel, is how do I respond to that? What do I do? So I have this powerful experience of radical amazement, is his term. And what happens now? How do I live my life in a way that integrates that or responds to it, or how has it changed? And that gives birth to religion for Heschel. And that was, in a funny way, true for me as a teenager. I'd have these experiences of whether in nature or something else, and just of closeness to the sacred. And the only language I knew was the Jewish language. I didn't know anything else at that time. And so I started putting on tefillin, in the morning, and I started doing a prayer practice and things like that. And I smile when I say that now, because that's not where I would go today. But that was the language I knew. So it was later when I went to college and later on that I learned other languages that in many ways became more nurturing, or at least became equally nurturing, or part of the whole. But it's almost funny to look back like, oh, so I'd have a big experience in nature and put on tefillin as an answer. But that is how it was at that time.
So it seems that they started like pretty balanced.
Mm.
You didn't recognize that there was an imbalance of like in many artists you could find, oh, there's too much chokhmah. No? There's a need of organization, grounding down. But you started pretty balanced. And
I don't know. I don't know if it's the chokhmah bina balance, but there's no. I mean, I think my whole life I've in dynamic tension around that balance. And finding a space where there's more chokhmah, which could be also chokhmah, creativity, also sexuality, also just living richly in the world. All of those, I think I had too little of those, and more, I was raised in a middle-class bourgeois family, so, I was told I was going to I went to a fancy school, and then I went to a fancier law school, and I did all of those things. And, but at the same time, I don't want to put that side down. I mean, that's been the source of my sustenance and career and financial security, and that's enabled my family to live in a way that we can. And so, yeah, I think to me, actually, it's one of the real gifts of the Kabbalah is that all of these, it's more actually less chokhmah bina and more netzach and hod, which is further down the tree. Hod are these moments of spark and creativity and amazement. And netzach is like, it's netzach. It's going on. It's enduring. It's you wake up. I made lunch for my daughter this morning. I packed up a lunchbox. We picked out the clothes. She did the thing, and some of that was connected to hod. I mean, it's lovely to do that, and yeah, that's very sweet. But part of it is netzach, right? It's like, after this, I got work to do and I have things and all that. So I highly doubt that there will be a time in my life where I've sorted out what that balance is. And it's never been present. There have certainly been times, fortunately, in my life where I've been able to devote myself to spiritual practice. So 5 months of retreat in 2008, 2009, for example. I certainly can't do that now. I made other choices to live this life. So there were times that were more allocated to that, or I lived in Israel for 3 years and doing more Kabbalah and more going up to Tzfat and having experiences. And I look back on that with a lot of fondness, even though there's no way I'm doing that now either.
So Shay, how to live the unity of God through the fragmented Jewish identity? All these separations, all these rituals that we have, they seem contradictory, but they have, I'm sure they have they're functional to the unity.
So I have a pretty non-traditional approach to a lot of to how we relate to Jewish tradition. So a non-traditional approach to tradition. I don't have a view that how I practice has like some kind of historical authenticity or is in some kind of spiritual continuity with every Jewish text or person who's ever lived. I don't think the tradition itself coheres that way. As a scholar, there's clearly biblical religion is doing this and Talmudic religion is doing that and medieval religion, and there's the mystical strain here and the philosophical strain here, and there's the a rationalistic and an anti-rationalistic, and it seems obvious as a scholar that there are multiple Judaisms that have existed and that obviously that still exist now. So for me, that's actually my entry point, because I think there's a tension that can arise when it's like I have to make everything fit, or I have to make it okay, or I have to align what I'm doing with it. And so this happens a lot in the spiritual world, for example. So, for example, you could take a mystical approach to Torah. It's a Hasidic one or a Zoharic one or whichever. Already I'm in multiple Judaisms. Sometimes you see that people will say, this is the truth this is the right one. This is the right, but traditionally, again, there's this notion the Torah exists on 4 levels: Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, that could be seen literally, or it could be seen allegorically, or it could be seen mystically. And already there, it's to me an understanding that there are multiple paths or multiple levels, and they just don't cohere. So for me, when I see the parts of Jewish ritual, for example, that are very focused on separating Jews from non-Jews, I see that historically as a scholar, and I understand this was an oppressed minority. This from thousands of years of its history. There's lots of trauma in that. There's a lot of persecution by the other, and so I don't affirm those distinctions that much. That's not operative in my life today, and I think they're harmful in general today. But they weren't always harmful. They come from historical reasons and conditions that are there, and so I don't, where there's the fragmentation, the us and themness, that's fundamental, I think, to Jewish tradition. It's hard to. I'd like to claim that it's just some little thing on the side, but it's really not. I mean, certainly in the Torah, it's clear. It's separate yourself from the nations, and here is how you do it. And a part of how you do it, it's a double separation. You separate yourselves from them because we're the people who separate. We keep Tameh and Tahor separate. We keep, all of these distinctions and separations, and order over chaos. We're on the side of order. They're on the side of chaos. That's not true, but that's the construction, that it's this binary of us and them. For me, these binaries, there's a lot of problems with binary thinking, and this is part of it. And I'm interested in moving beyond that. But I don't have a claim that the true Judaism is my Judaism, the one that I particularly, this is the one that aligns with all of my views. That's the real one and everyone else has it wrong. I don't have that view. I think that view is part of the problem. And progressives have it too. It's not just a conservative, this isn't right and left or anything. You can go to progressive spaces and you'll see people say things like Judaism's true values are about, this social justice thing. And so for me, it's about discerning what leads me closer to that compassion and what builds a more just world and what's more in alignment with my heart and with my relationships with others, with my community. And those are much fuzzier than a view, whether it's an Orthodox one or a very progressive one or whatever, that this is what the tradition has always been. It's not how I roll it.
No, yes, it's. I always find very mysterious the word continuity. It's such a dear word to me. It's like being in front of the Tetragrammaton, continuity.
Yeah.
It's magic.
It's funny too, because there's about 15, 20 years ago, I used to be active in the Jewish organizational world, and that was the buzzword. Jewish continuity, yeah. And this is what we wanted, because American Jews are always afraid their children are going to marry non-Jews or whatever. So they come up with different things. Sometimes it's Jewish engagement, sometimes Jewish identity. For a while, it was Jewish continuity. What can we do to ensure? And it's just funny that, what does that mean? I mean, there's a continuity historically. There could be a continuity in terms of, but everything is changing, right? Constantly. And
but what about the whisper? Like when you imagine the word whispered, like in the dawn, continuity. It's very mysterious.
Yeah, there's something. Look, there's a sweetness to continuity, right? There's something lovely about. I do sometimes reflect. So, for example, I've written about the shofar, right? So you hear the shofar, and it is a kind of magic of continuity. First of all, there is some evidence.
It breaks the shofar. The sound breaks,
right?
But also unites.
That's right.
Like the law. No?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. There is evidence that this ram's horn has been used for thousands of years in this tribe, this weird little tribe that I'm part of. And there's something amazing to that. Whatever I make theology or ideas or politics or any of that stuff, if I'm in with other, even by myself, I was going to say with other Jews, but even by myself on Rosh Hashanah, and I hear the sound of the shofar, there's that's the kind of continuity that I do find inspiring, that there's this ancient primal thing that I can't pretend to understand what the shofar really meant for these biblical Israelites and Canaanites, in the Iron Age, but there is some magic to it, right? And there is that connection that is a heart connection for me. And I'm nourished by other traditions as well. it's just also true that this heart connection is been part of me since I was born.
Mhm. And then you immerse yourself also in Buddhism, no?
Mhm.
In meditation.
Mhm. Mm-hmm.
And its main characteristic of feeling, could we say, feeling?
For me, I think it's different. Again,
No.
there's no one approach to Buddhism any more than to Judaism. For me, it's kind of it's a knowing as well as a feeling. There's a settledness that comes from the practices of settling the mind and relaxing into the mind itself that are very powerful for me. They're also kind of mystical. They're not just rational. I also, for a while, I've been teaching mindfulness in the secular world, and it's a little more rational and tools, and here's how you can do this and that. But for me personally, it's not that. It's also a way of settling into whatever it is that we settle into when we settle in. And that for me, that way in has been foundationally nourishing for me. Like it's been really the core for me for 10 years now, a little bit more, almost 20 years actually. And yeah, I feel really tenderly toward it as well. I mean, of course, there's also Jewish forms of meditation and plenty of Jewish contemplative practice, but the Buddhist ones that I now teach in are really carefully thought out in a way that you don't systematically, in a way that you don't really find in the Jewish sources. And I understand these are two very different traditions, and maybe it's unwise to really commit to more than one, but spiritual monogamy or something. But I'm a spiritual polyamorist. This is the
So the meditation seems that it eases, soften the crisis with the mind. That it seems that within Kabbalah, no, we have this idea of the Tehon, this huge crisis that throw us into the darkness, and then we come up in better shape. But it seems that we have this earthquake of the Tehon. But could we say that if we engaged more in meditation, we could ease that episode to unfold? We could deal with the crisis of the mind in incremental stages.
I don't know. I haven't thought of it that way. I feel like in all of these myths where there's entering the shadow, the hero's journey, I don't know if we want to soften it. I think you gotta have that journey. Yeah, I don't.
We can skip the great fall.
It doesn't seem that way. Even in some Buddhist maps of contemplative awareness that I'm familiar with, you do go through periods of suffering. And it's not. I don't know that there's ever an idea like, could we soften this? Could we make this a little easier? It's more, this is part of, I guess in some of the Buddhist frames, these are the tools that you use to work through those periods, but it's not making them easier. And definitely, I'm reluctant to mix myths a little bit. It feels to me like the Jewish or the Kabbalistic myths are a little more like really going into that darkness, and that to me feels really valuable. If everybody spent a little time looking at the shadow rather than finding ways to paper it over, surely the world would be better. People might have a harder time, but finding some myth that all of my brokenness will be forgiven in some way by some cosmic magic trick, these kinds of shortcuts I don't think bring us a more peaceful world.
Jay, I found very, very enlightening your approach of easing the suffering slowly, little by little,
Mm.
and not having like a huge expectation, no? And I'd like to ask you how uh, how was your journey from the, maybe I'm wrong, but from strong experiences of enlightenment and study and social activism. It seems that they are synthesized,
Mm.
canalized slowly into being uh, an instrument of healing.
Mm.
Healing in a small way,
Mm.
a big way too, but very specifically. Healing, trying to ease someone suffering 10% or 20%.
Mm.
Uh, I find very interesting, and I like to know more about this because I see other mystics
Mm.
that also they, at one point in their lives, maybe at the middle of their lives, they start to turn
Mm.
slowly into this activity.
Mm.
Like my teacher Yuval Asherov in Israel, he does acupuncture.
Mm.
Alejandro Jodorowsky,
Mhm.
who does his psychology
Mhm.
systems. Even Mario Saban, who with his consultations. So the specific healing,
Mm.
and in the background of this tremendous life of experiences
Mm.
and achievements, the small healing. I find it very poetic too.
Mm. That's interesting.
I don't know
I,
if I well describe it in few
yeah,
words.
I don't know if I have. I definitely don't have a recipe or an answer that I've.
No, it's just a comment that I wanted to
Yeah,
share
I
with
mean, I
you.
think to me
The doctor, the Jewish doctor.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know?
yeah. Oh, my late mother would be very happy.
Sí, sí, sí.
It's the one thing I didn't do. I was a lawyer, but I wasn't a
Sí.
doctor. I think for me, it's just based on the world as we find it. You know, there's some small, very small, I think, percentage of people who are interested in what I would call a more transformative spirituality. And most people are not, right? And so I don't think, and I know other people have a different view, but I don't think that everybody has within them, you know, some interest or desire in going in this direction of human flourishing. Some people like sports, and some people like music, and some people like spirituality, and I don't think everybody's, you know, the same. So, but for the everybody else, which is almost everybody on the planet, yeah, it's the question. I mean, the Buddha said, I just teach suffering and the end of suffering, and when we see suffering, we want to meet it where it is and see what, there's a movement of the heart to see what it is, and if that's acupuncture, that's acupuncture. For me, I don't know any acupuncture. You know, it might be teaching mindfulness in a way that can just relieve someone's anxiety in a very ordinary, not weird way. Weird for me is a good thing, but you know, just in a way that can meet the suffering where it is and maybe help it. So for me, that feels very natural. And I've always, even just in this part of my work, liked to have a little bit of each. So for a while, I was teaching this kind of Buddhist meditation called jhana meditation, which cultivates these very amazing mind states. And it takes a while to do that. You know, it takes at least really a week on retreat, and you have to really do it a certain way. And it's only going to be available to a small percentage of people. So I love that, you know, the deep end of the pool, so to speak. But then I also like look over my shoulder and what about, you know, reaching a wider audience of people who could really benefit from meditation in particular. Same in the Jewish frame. You know, Kabbalah is going to be of interest to some people, but not to most folks. And I think, it's finding, a translation where there's something that is of interest to where people actually are. That feels like a very organic, it's again another balancing, right? So let's call it the deep end and the broad end. More people are going to be able to benefit from a good acupuncture session than from a good Kabbalah study, right? So it's finding both of those. Yeah.
And what could you say about under your experience, how would you what type of approach would you recommend in studying Kabbalah nowadays? Knowing all what you know, all the experience that you have.
Yeah, I think so. One of my teachers,
the strong points and the weak points.
Yeah, one of my teachers, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalome, used to say that one of the pitfalls of Kabbalah, the place where we could fall down, is in getting distracted by what he called the angel shit, which is all the like, this connects to that, connects to that, connects to that, connects to that, connects to that.
All the symbolics.
And like, yeah, so some amount of that is incredibly nourishing and having this mythic symbolic vocabulary. It could also become a kind of like, almost like a game, not in a great way, and I know all this secret stuff, and I have all this secret power, and there's this kind of ego piece that comes in, and some popularizers of Kabbalah teach that as a positive. You can get the power, and you can, for me, I think it's just about checking in with the heart of a possible teacher and seeing, is this person, keeping the bullshit detector handy, does this person have the mind piece, the intellectual knowledge, really knowing the material in the original languages, and not necessarily teaching, you can teach in translation, but knowing it, and also the heart piece of, is this someone who's practicing a kind of humility, and not falling into this trap of power, because there is a way to gain power, not in a magical way, but just by having this kind of secret stuff that somebody wants to pay money for or something like that, and then it's a temptation. And I think I've seen plenty of teachers succumb to that, but there's a lot of great teachers out there now who are, that's more, if there's an interest in this path, there's more opportunity now than ever before in history, and by a lot. And it used to be available just to a tiny number of elite male Jews.
Now it's overwhelming.
Now it's right. And so I think now it's less accessing it, that's now easy, and more discerning and spending time. So I think that's clarifying one's own interests or goals, like what's resonating here? Why is this path among all of the other ones? Why is there a resonance here? It doesn't have to be specific, like analyzing everything. It could just be there's a resonance in the soul or the heart or whatever that feels that might be enough. And then seeing, keeping that dynamic balance, like we said before, of Chokhmah and Bina, where there's that intuitive spark and you see it met in a teacher, but also the Bina, also the like, okay, what are the discernment around, is this, does this feel right? Does this feel balanced? Does it seem integrated? And, you're fortunate to have found these teachers in your life. And I meet a lot of people who have found ones that weren't so nourishing for them. And maybe, hopefully, I don't teach really myself in this way anymore, but in showing people, connecting people or weaving them is really rewarding. Yeah.
Yes, I personally like the structure, the syntax. No, not. I'm not into symbols or metaphors. I'm very careful. Well, basically because of the way I practice art and also the way I see everything. No, I always I like what Susan Sontag once said about symbol, metaphors and disease. No, it doesn't help you if you say, I have this monster eating me. No, when you have a disease, it helps you seeing what it is. You know?
Right, right.
So I approach that for everything, no? And that's why I do abstraction and I deal with very basic elements. No? But so I'm very, very careful. I agree with you that we need to be careful with the magic side and the Baroquism of the symbols. But I think we have plenty of structures to study, no? That of syntax that we can spend a lot of efforts.
Spend a few lifetimes, I think.
So do you want to say anything?
No, I think it's definitely remarkable that there are so many people interested in this body of esoteric and mystical wisdom. And I encourage them to follow that spark and see, maybe there is some ancestry that they're not aware of genealogically, or maybe it's just a spiritual genealogy. And I've seen it many times among some of my own students over the years. There's a mysterious resonance that occurs. People from different traditions, and yet there's some sort of resonance there. And I don't claim to have an answer to what that is, but it definitely it's a source of, like we were saying before with the metaphor of the dawn, it's a spark that can lead to real meaning in life and in spiritual practice. And again, I've seen that many, many times. And it's inspiring. It's inspiring to see so many people in this community. And it's not the only one, like it in the world, that there does seem to be, if you look at it, it's surprising maybe that this body of medieval literature is somehow, there's not a lot of bodies of medieval literature that are this connecting and inspiring to people.
It happened in Spain, and now in Spain,
it's come back right to the source, right? I mean, it's
language, the poetics of the language maybe has something to do.
Yeah, Spain and Provence, and look, this is where this is the birthplace of the Kabbalah, and it's to me, I don't have an answer for why this resonance is happening in this particular place, but it's certainly striking. And I remember, myself just going to Spain, South Spain and Catalonia as a tourist, and just, you go places, and when I go to Girona, I know Azriel and Girona, right? So like none of my other tourists are doing, they were all around taking pictures or whatever. And I'm wondering, was this the hill?
Remember that mosaic on the floor?
I do remember that actually, yeah. And you just, we were talking before about what are these resonances? What's this connection? And, when you're in the physical space, there is some kind of a connection, energy, resonance. I have no idea what. That's not something I know about, but there's a feeling that's there that feels really nourishing and connecting. And so it's amazing to think that, where are we, 800 years after, some of these, very unusual figures, spiritual figures did their work, that there's this reawakening is really profound.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.